Hello, everyone. In this, I'm going to be talking about the Rite of Champions, which was on Saturday, just 2 days ago, and how the event went, and the deck that I played, and some thoughts going forward. I originally recorded a version of this on Friday evening before the event because I wanted to talk about this deck and how I felt before the event happened, so I wasn't influenced by how it went, and then I would do a recap afterwards, basically looking back, saying, was I right? Was I wrong? How did it go? But the audio for that was really bad, so I decided to just scrap the whole thing and just record it all now. So, spoiler alert, I won the event. I am the back-to-back Gladiator champion, which is cool. And this deck actually worked out quite well. So I'm going to talk about some of the decisions that I made making this deck and the matches that I played and how they each went. Alright, so when I was trying to decide what I was going to play in this event, I had a bit of a tricky time because I had no confidence in anything. Towards the beginning of the season, at the beginning of the year, I was pretty confident I was just going to play Jeskai again. Jeskai was really good. And during the season, it continued to be really good when other people played it. Barfling completely annihilated people with it, did super well. Howdy also had a 5-0 with Jeskai. I played Jeskai 3 times, and overall I think I went 3-5. It was not good. I was not figuring it out. So that was rough. I did pretty well with Abzan at the beginning of the season, but I didn't really want to bring that. Honestly, I probably should have thought about Abzan more. But overall, like, I had not really been doing well with anything. I did not have high confidence in anything. And I sort of just picked Esper because it had a lot of Wraths, and I thought Wraths will be good against Guide of Souls, and then we'll figure it out and see what happens. So around a week before the event, I sort of just picked Esper and said, I'm just going to test with this and see if I can make it as good as I can and hope that it'll work out. So, of course, what drew me is all these good Wraths, right? Wrath of God, Day of Judgment, Damnation, Sunfall, Toxic Deluge, Supreme Verdict, and Languish is also pretty good in this format. Right now, most decks have maybe one or two creatures that don't die to Languish, but a lot of them also have Tajik, which is a creature that does die to Languish and doesn't die to Damnation. So they're very close. They're a lot closer than they might seem at first glance. Now, Esper Control is a deck that I have a sort of strange history with. When I first got into the format about 2 years ago, in May of 2023, I played Control for a few months. I did really, really well. I had great results. Other people who played Control had great results. There was about a 3-month period where it was incredibly powerful, and then it started to drop off pretty quickly. And for the past year and a half, I hadn't played Esper at all. And then about 2 weeks ago, in one of the weekday events, I decided, you know what, I'm going to rebuild Esper. I'm going to play Esper. Everybody's trying to play these creature decks. I'll toss in some Wraths and we'll see how it goes. And I went 2-1. I lost to a mono red deck, which made sense because my build for that event was a lot less focused on creature-based decks and aggro decks. I think I don't know if I had as many Wraths. I think I might have not had like Languish. And then I also had more card draw, more late game kind of stuff, more like 5 and 6 mana cards. So I decided, okay, we'll slim down, we'll add a bunch of cheap removal, and make sure we have all these Wraths, and just hope that this is good enough that maybe Control can be good in a field where I'm just going to hope that I don't play against any other Control decks or any combo decks, and if all my opponents have at least 30 creatures, then I'll be fine. And it turned out that that's pretty much what happened. I was correct in that assumption that I wouldn't, well, I was correct in the hope that I wouldn't play against any of those decks, and that was certainly a huge boon. Because I only ended up playing 2 hard counterspells in the whole deck. There's a counterspell, there's a 3 steps ahead, and then there's a couple, there's like Reprieve and Memory Lapse, but if my opponents wanted a certain spell to resolve, they had a relatively easy time getting it to do so. I also wanted to have more one mana removal. I thought that my first opponent had a good chance to be on red white aggro, so I wanted to have some more one mana answers to creatures. I think Unable to Scream is just a pretty good card. Like this card is not Swords to Plowshares, but it's like 90% of Swords to Plowshares in a lot of matchups, which is certainly good enough. Condemn as well. Everybody's trying to attack me. I'm certainly hoping to be the slowest deck in the format, or in the field. So this is a pretty good removal spell. Portable Hole also, it's just fine. Occasionally it can hit like a Winter Moon or a Verdant Tread, which is some pretty nice upside. And then you've just got some the normal ones, stuff like Fatal Push and Cut Down. Other than that, the main card that I think maybe you should see a bit more play than it actually does is Demonic Bargain. In a deck where you don't have one specific combo that you need to get, this card is pretty close to just a 3-mana tutor, because there's so much redundancy, right? If you want a 4-mana Wrath, there's like 5 of those, and all of them basically do the same thing. If you want a card advantage engine, maybe the best one is Shadow of the Second Sun, but Rusko and Teferi are close enough that like you wouldn't mind getting them. So I think this card just generally plays out pretty well. 3 mana is kind of a lot, and there aren't a ton of other decks that would really want it, but I do like this include, and I'm happy with that decision. The other one I actually want to mention is Baconia. This one does see a lot of play, but especially in blue decks. I think the blue Specialize is an incredibly powerful late game tool. You get the best creature and the best spell from all graveyards, so you can just get like a Dig Through Time or a counter spell or something, and that's also just a 2-for-1. So the blue Specialize I think is really strong. Also Graveyard Hate, I was expecting a lot of Abzan. So I'm happy with this include as well as a 2-mana creature. So that's the deck that I had built, and going into the event I was not very confident again, because I had played this deck once in an event in the last year and a half, and I did not have I had a solid season. I did pretty well, but it did not feel like it in the moment. I had no 5-0s this season, so I had never won 4 matches in a row in an event, so if I was going to do here, it would have to be for the first time. Control decks have not been doing very well recently either in general, so I felt like I was taking a fairly big risk on just hoping that I was going to get the right matchups and that the deck was better than its recent results might suggest that a deck like this would be. And that I did not expect to win, but I thought, well, this is what I've got. I might as well send it and we'll give it a shot. So going into my first match, I expected it to be red-white aggro, which is a deck that I tested against, and at least in that I felt favored, but not by a huge amount. Being on the play is a big deal in that kind of matchup. Getting the Wrath before they get to turn 4 is really nice, as well as just being more likely to have an answer to any super problematic creature like a Ragavan is really good. But they were actually on Black-White Enchantress, which I think was actually a better matchup for me, because they didn't really have the ability to overrun me in the way that the red-white deck could. So in both games, they both went. They both didn't go exactly the same, but they both followed a similar pattern of they played a couple threats. I was able to answer them. I did have a nice play. I was able to use Fractured Identity on the Overlord of the Mistmoors, which had been impended, but when you play Fractured Identity, you just get hit as a 6/6. That was really good. And they didn't have enough pressure. They didn't have enough disruption, so I was able to answer everything they did, gain a bunch of card advantage, and eventually close out the game. So those 2 games went about as I expected, and when I saw the matchup, I thought, okay, this is probably a pretty good matchup. I feel good about my odds, and that went well. So I don't really have a lot to say about that matchup. Match 2, though, is where things got very dicey. So I was against red black mid range, and something else I knew going in is that if my opponent cast Blood Moon, I probably just couldn't win. It's a card that, if it's on the table, unless I have a very specific, like I need to have one of my 2 basic plans and my Witch Enchanter, or else there's nothing I can really do. Maybe I have 2 lands and a prismatic ending, but like the combination that I would need is very specific. And this deck had Blood Moon and Winter Moon. So I thought, okay, I am going to have to get a little bit lucky. But in general, I think it should be a good matchup because it's a deck that plays a lot of creature removal, which is generally not very good against me, and is also relatively slow. It's not prone to having these super fast draws that will just kill you before you can do anything. So even if I don't have a great series of answers, I should be able to get my feet under me before I really feel pressure. And game one did not feel good to play because I felt like I was doing all right at every point in the game. Every trait that I made, every turn, I felt like I was gaining more advantage. And then towards the end of the game, I just looked at the board and I was really far behind. And I looked at this and I felt like I never identified a point at which my opponent had gained that advantage over me, and I just sort of lost in what felt like it was out of nowhere. And that loss, and that was a game where they didn't even play Blood Moon or Winter Moon. They just had a sort of normal draw, and I just didn't have anything I could do about it. I'm sure I made mistakes at some point, but I didn't know what they were at the time. I never felt like the game was out of control, and then all of a sudden it just was. So going into game 2, I was not optimistic, and my lack of optimism was compounded upon when they cast a gamble on turn 1 and discarded a Blood Tide Harvester. And I said up top, if they play Blood Moon, I can't win. It's just not possible. And I had the counterspell in my hand if they gambled for Blood Moon, but the problem is, if I hold up counterspell every single turn, I can just never tap out. So if they just play a creature, I have to just let it resolve. If they, like, I'm stuck holding these 2 lands up for the entirety of the game, and the way my hand was, I had like Planeswalkers and sorcery speed removal, so it would have been really rough if they, even if they never cast the Blood Moon, they just play 1 or 2 creatures. I can't afford to answer them without getting hit by Blood Moon, which would beat me. So I saw this and my heart kind of sank a little bit. I was like, well, I guess this is going to be it. So I play my second land, I pass. They play a Smuggler's Copter. I play my third land, I say go, and then they untap and they cast Goblin Engineer. And I looked at this and I thought for a second, because I knew that they had Winter Moon in their deck. So they could use the Goblin Engineer to find the Winter Moon and then turn the Smuggler's Copter into the Winter Moon, and that would be pretty tough for me to beat. But they also had, I think it's called Gixian Recycler, which is just it's a creature, it's an artifact creature with Unearth that when it dies or is put into your graveyard, you get another copy of it into your graveyard. And the problem, if they had gotten that even instead of Winter Moon, was because I couldn't tap out without getting hit by Winter Moon, even if I played my Tasha, which was my answer to a Gixian Recycler, I would still just lose to Winter Moon. So there was no real way out of this that I could see, unless they had gambled for Goblin Engineer. But the thing is, at the time, I thought this wouldn't make any sense because they know I have tons of removal in my deck. And it just happened that I didn't have, an instant speed, like I didn't have a Fatal Push. But if I'd had a Fatal Push, then I just Fatal Push the Goblin Engineer, and I keep holding up Counterspell for Blood Moon. So I thought, there's no way they didn't. I thought it was very unlikely that they didn't tutor for Blood Moon there. But I didn't think I was going to win if the Goblin Engineer resolved, and I especially wouldn't if they also had Blood Moon. So I ended up countering it, thinking I can win the game if one of two things is true. Either they tutored for Goblin Engineer and they just don't have Blood Moon, or I play Tasha and tick it up to 5. They play Blood Moon. I tick up Tasha to 6. If they don't have a creature to crew the copter or a way to deal damage to Tasha, I can -6 Tasha and hope that I hit 3 good creatures that they don't have answers for, and then I can kill them with that. A bit of a long shot because it basically requires them not to have creatures or removal, which is very unlikely considering that's the majority of their deck. But I figured I just had to take a shot, and if I didn't do this, I wasn't going to win the game. So I played Natasha, and I pass the turn, and they untap, and they tap 3 lands, and they cast a red card, and it's Detective Phoenix. They didn't get Blood Moon, and they were able to end up killing Natasha, but I was able to cast my spells, and I thought, okay, this is fine. Now that I know I haven't completely lost yet, it's okay. I'm gonna play out the rest of my hand. It's gonna be all right. And I thought my hand was pretty good, but my hand quickly became a lot worse than I thought it was gonna be. I ended up having to basically spend every card in my hand to protect my planeswalkers, but they both died anyway. So after the Sword of Dust had settled, there was nothing in play, but I had no relevant cards in my hand. And my opponent, I think, had 1 or 2, but they weren't playing any creatures, so I was pretty confident that they were just removal. And at this point, I knew that I just had to top deck better than they did. I just had to get lucky, and if I didn't, then that was going to be the match. But if I did, I'd have a shot. And I did. I got really lucky. I drew Shadow of the Second Sun, which was probably the best draw in my whole deck. And I was able to use this to get enough cards to overwhelm them and make it to game 3. And then game 3, finally a game played out the way I really wanted it to, where they played a couple creatures. I had a Wrath. I used Fractured Identity to deal with 2 of their permanents, and then they just sort of ran out of gas, and I was able to take over the game from there. That game, they did also have a Winter Moon, which would have been a big issue were it not for the fact that I had a basic Plains, a Black-White Surveil, and a Misty Rainforest, so I just fetched an island, and of my first 3 lands, 2 were basic, so the Winter Moon didn't really do anything, and they ended up discarding it even after I bounced it with Teferi to a Liliana, because it would have hurt them just as much as it hurt me. So I was pretty happy about that game, and I was sort of astonished at the end of that match that I had won, because after the first game and after the first turn of game 2, I would have put my chances to win the match at something like, I don't know, 10%. I had no confidence. I thought, this is not going to work, and somehow it did. And I guess you just always play it out, and sometimes it works. And in that case, it worked out. So I made it into the semifinals. Now, going into semifinals, I was a lot more confident than I was going to quarterfinals because I knew my opponent was going to be on Abzan. The other quarterfinal match was an Abzan mirror, and at least in my testing and in my building of the deck, Abzan is the matchup I was most confident in of the decks that I expected to appear in the event. Basically, you play a Wrath. They generally don't have enough pressure to kill you early, so you just get to turn 4, you play a Wrath, and from that point on, even though they have some amount of recursion, it's generally not enough to deal with just card advantage. Cards like Stock Up and Dig Through Time will generally just outperform and are more consistent than the types of recursion that they have. And you do have a little bit of graveyard hate with cards like Viconia and Bogger Trawler, which can just sort of seal the deal on a game that you're already ahead in. So I was very confident in this matchup. Game 1, I believe they kept a 1-lander with a Birds of Paradise, and they were able to use Fauna Shaman to turn some of their creatures into creature lands like Witch Enchanter. But it was just way too slow for them to deal with what I was doing. They did actually grief scam me. They tutored for grief, and they had drawn the Ephemerate, so they were able to do that. but I had Fractured Identity that I had put on top of my deck. So then I just drew it and I took their grief and I used the grief on them, and then their Ephemerate didn't do anything. And from that point on, that game was just kind of over. They just had nowhere near enough mana, and I think I had like a Jace the Mind Sculptor, so that game uh, just went very well and was over very quickly. And then in game two, I was doing pretty well. I got them to play out most of their hand, and I drew a Denick for the turn. I was like, okay, I'll play this Denick. That's a good blocker. They played out like the last two cards in their hands. So they had, I think, about 4 creatures in play and no cards in hand. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to Snapcaster my Tainted Pact. I'm going to find a Wrath. I'm going to cast it. They're going to have no creatures in play, no cards in hand. I've got this Luring Reveal to refill my hand, and it's all going to be great. I'm going to be super far ahead, and that's going to be a game. And you can see in the video, I tap 2 lands to cast the Snapcaster Mage, and then I pause, and I look at my Denick, and I go, oh no, this doesn't work. Because Denick, of course, cards in graveyards can't be the target of spells or abilities. Stop Snapcaster Mage from doing anything. So if I had cast that Snapcaster Mage, I would have been in big trouble because I had no other answer for their board. And that board could have killed me if I'd had nothing. So I actually ended up using Fatal Push on my own Denick to be able to Snapcaster Tainted Pact for Wrath, which, ended up putting me, I guess, down a lot of cards, but they had nothing left in play, so it didn't end up mattering, because then I just cast Luring Revealed, found it's a fairy, and from that point on, that game was just over. So that was the semifinals, and that brought me to the finals. Now, for the finals, I was against Howdy on Jeskai. And I was a little bit concerned about this matchup because I did not play against Jeskai at all while preparing for this event. So I had no idea how this was going to go. But I did have some amount of confidence. Firstly, because I had won 3 matches in a row, which I did not really expect to do, but I had gotten a little lucky and gotten some good matchups. So I thought, okay, this deck is better than I feared it was going to be. I feared that this deck was just going to suck, and control decks are bad. I was going to lose in round 1, and that was going to be that. But I felt like at this point in the event, I had proven to myself that this deck has legs and can win matches. So I thought, okay, this is fine. And Jeskai decks, and especially more current Jeskai decks, and especially Howdy's Jeskai deck, are more aggressive and more creature focused. They play a lot more to the board early, which means that the Wraths are actually quite a bit better. They're not playing cards like 5 mana Teferi that are very good, very resilient against Wraths, and their play patterns aren't going to be the sort of play 1 creature at a time that threatens to kill you, something like a Thieving Haven that forces you to have a Wrath each time in response, which is just a very inefficient way of dealing with that sort of board presence. And a major reason for that is that a lot of these decks are trying to play Guide of Souls. Guide of Souls is a card you have to play 3 more creatures after it in order for it to be an effective card. So the way these decks are designed and the way people play them out tends to be committing to the board very heavily. So I felt pretty decent about that going in. Now, game 1 was it was a long game. It was a bit of a slog. I mulliganed to 6, and my hand was fine, but not amazing. I think it was like 3 lands, a Denick, a Dig Through Time, and a Damnation. So I thought, okay, this is solid, this is fine. And I drew a Demonic Bargain, which I used to get Tasha in play. And my opponent, Howdy, had Ace Flockbringer, which I did not have an answer for, which when you play a creature, you get a copy of it into your hand once a turn, and the copy flies. So they start playing creatures, they start getting copies, and one of those creatures that they got copies of was Enduring Curiosity, which when it dies comes back as an enchantment, so that's pretty good against Damnation. But Tasha bought me so much time and so much life that by the time I cast Damnation, even though they had 2 Enduring Curiosities now on board, so if they ever hit me, they were going to draw 2 extra cards per creature. My plan at that point was, I'm just never going to let them hit me for the rest of the game. I knew they had a Ragavan in their hand, but I had a Tasha. So as long as I just kept ticking up the Tasha, the Ragavan could never attack, so I wasn't worried about that. And outside of a few other haste creatures, there's nothing that would let them get in an attack before I get to untap. And I've had Shadow of the Second Sun at this point that I found off Dig Through Time, and start generating advantage. So it was actually interesting listening to the commentary from the coverage of this game, because basically for like 20 minutes, um, I like the general sentiment among them was, I was on the back seat. Howdy was, applying a lot of pressure and getting all this card advantage. They would play an Enduring Curiosity and get a copy of it, and then I reprieved it, so then they could play another creature and get another copy. And they got, I think, like 2 extra creatures out of the Ace Flockbringer. So they were getting a lot of cards, but the way that my draw lined up, they just had no answer to Tasha. And a Tasha plus a Damnation, they they had a bunch of creatures. They were generating some good advantages, but they just didn't have an answer for that. And after I play the Damnation, like if you look at the board before the Damnation, you see that they have all these Enduring Curiosities and all these creatures. It's like, okay, even if the board goes away, they're left with so much. But after I cast the Damnation, you look at the board and it's like, actually, there's kind of nothing here. Like there's no obvious way that they're going to be able to get any value out of these enchantments. And in the end, they weren't able to. They played an Narset, I killed it, and that was kind of all they had. They drew a couple lands, and then I think they drew a couple lands, like a counter spell, and then I think like one more creature, and a removal spell. But they didn't draw anything that could let them hit me, so they never got any more advantage out of that. And it was the kind of game where it felt like I was behind for a long time, but the way the cards lined up, I was actually doing fine for most of it, because Howdy just didn't have a way to ever break through. Tasha just completely held off everything they were trying to do for enough turns that I could get my Dig Through Time out, and that was kind of that. Game 2 was very fast. Howdy had an atrocious draw. I think they looked at they looked at 4 one-land hands in a row, and then didn't draw a land, I think basically all game. Um, so that was that's not how you want it to go, really. So I mean, I say I curved out. I played like Viconia into like Palantir into Tasha, um, which, yeah, is curving out. And even though that's not the most aggressive curvo, it is fast enough that the game just ended in a couple turns, and that was that. So really not much to say about game 2. Just 4 terrible hands in a row, and that was that. And then in game 3, I had a sort of interesting 7. It was 3 lands, a Toxic Deluge, a Palantir of Orthanc, a Rusko, and a Harvester of Misery, uh, which would have been great, but for the fact that none of my lands actually tapped for black, so I had no way to actually interact. If I had had a black land, that hand would have been pretty amazing, I think, because I would have been able to discard the Harvester on turn 2 to kill a creature. I had Toxic Deluge if I wanted to go that route instead. I have Rusko and Palantir, which are both cards that are very difficult for them to deal with. They don't have a lot of artifact removal. But I thought, if I don't draw black mana, this hand loses so fast, because it does nothing. So I shipped that, and I ended up with a very strange 6, where I had a Bleachbone Verge, 2 of these MDFC lands, Witch Enchanter and Razorgrass Ambush, and a couple removal spells. So I needed things to work out pretty well, but they ended up doing so, because I had removal for each of Howdy's first 3 creatures, which were all pretty good, so that was good. And then Howdy did not have anything left in their hand to continue to apply pressure to me. I think they had like a Solitude and a Flage, but the Flage was not close to being able to be escaped, and the Solitude with no targets doesn't really do anything. And then I think, and they had a counterspell. So I had enough time to find the blue mana that I needed to start casting my other spells. And over the course of that game, from that point on, I was generally ahead. I had Diviner Fates. I made a copy of it 3 steps ahead. So I was drawing a bunch of cards. I was seeking a bunch of cards. But they were keeping up because they had cards like Fractured Identity, which stole my Diviner Fates. So that's, what, a 3-for-1, I think? So I was certainly ahead, but not so far ahead that the game was completely over. Um, and just as I was getting to that point, they cast House Meld on my manifested Jace the Mind Sculptor. And it was a great moment on coverage when they revealed this, because I had no answer to this. And I had a Memory Deluge in my graveyard, which I flashbacked to try to find either a counterspell or an instant speed removal spell would have done it, because I had the mana. I could just kill the manifested Jace in response, and then they wouldn't get anything. But I did find that I found 5 lands, a Supreme Verdict, and a Prismatic Ending, neither of which could actually kill the Jace. So I let them steal a Jace as an enchantment, so I couldn't attack it. And it had no loyalty, but they could still activate the abilities. So it was basically just a brainstorm machine. They could just brainstorm every turn. And at that point, I thought I had the game locked up. I thought I was basically just going to win. And I saw this, I was like, oh crap, I have no answer to this. If they find like a counter spell off this Jace, and then they find a few more threats, this game could turn around very quickly. But fortunately, after the terrible Memory Deluge, I scribed with Castle of Mantras and I found Fractured Identity. So I was able to steal my Jace back. And they didn't have a counterspell. And from that point on, I was actually in control of the game, and I was able to use that card advantage to run it out and get a 3-0 win in the finals, and become back-to-back champion. So overall, this went better than I expected it to, but given the matchups that I got, I think it went about as I expected. I mentioned as well in the Discord that I don't think I would have beaten any combo deck, and I think I would have had a tough time against most control decks. Of course, if the other control decks were also as built to deal with creature-based decks as I was, then maybe we would have had a very, I guess, boring back and forth where we're each sitting on 5 rats and we have nothing to do. But overall, I was just hoping to play against Guide of Souls players, and I did. I played against 3 Guide of Souls players, and I didn't drop a game to any of them, and that was my goal. That was my plan, and it worked out pretty well. I don't think this deck is that good. I don't think if you play it in like a Saturday or a Proving Grounds event that you're necessarily going to do that well, because there's just too many bad matchups. Because the deck is so built to deal with a specific type of deck, and in a more open field, who knows what you're going to play against. But for that event, I think it was a great call, and I'm really happy with the fact that even though I had not had great success with any specific deck, and I didn't have confidence in any specific deck over the course of the season, I was able to recognize what was going to be good in this tournament in particular, and build a deck that took advantage of that and made specific card choices that furthered those goals. Things like the 1-mana removal inclusions, and Demonic Bargain, and Viconia, Denic, that sort of thing. I think I played the right deck for the event, and I'm happy with my ability to make that decision, even when I had very little to base it off of. Especially in comparison to the last top 16, I knew what I was going to play like 2 months before the event. I was going to play Jeskai, because Jeskai was great, and I was winning a lot with it, and other people were winning with it, and it's a deck that doesn't really have that many like bad matchups, because it just does everything, and it could do everything well. And I had been doing really well all year. I was very confident in myself. I was like, I got this, and then I did. It went about as I expected, and it felt great. And for this one, I came in with a lot less confidence. But I think, despite the fact that I made a couple I know of at least a couple obvious mistakes that I made in my play during the event. I think the deck that I chose and the way I built it, I'm happy with what I did in that regard. So that was the event. That's all I have to really say about it. Um, I I think Gladiator is in an interesting place where everybody's talking about Guide of Souls. Everybody's saying, "Oh, this card is too good. Um, ban it, get rid of it. It's the games are too homogenous. Everybody's just trying to, you have a nice game, and then you Ranger Reveals for Guide Pride, and a lot of decks. There's just nothing they can do about it." And I I sort of disagree. Like I sort of waffle on this, where I probably am the least interested in banning Guide of Souls of almost anyone. I am the one crusading for it to stay legal, um, partially because it's very easy to take advantage of. In this event, honestly, if Guide of Souls had been banned before this event, I maybe wouldn't have won because my deck relied on other people all putting Guide of Souls in their deck. Um, but that's the sort of thing that only really works in a top 16 field like this, in an open tournament or just in an LFGQ. People are just playing random stuff. They're just playing whatever they want, and I can see an argument for how Guide Pride, like it's really Guide Pride together. I think that makes the games too or more homogenous than people want, and sort of closes the door too quickly on certain archetypes that people don't think should be happening. I don't. I think this event shows that it's not a matter strictly of Guide of Souls being like too hard to beat, because if you want to beat it, you absolutely can. It's just a matter of it doesn't lead to good gameplay, and it shuts out certain decks too quickly. So along those lines, I could see people wanting to get rid of Guide of Souls. Um, I don't think it's like the most fun card in the world, so I wouldn't be that upset about it. Um, but I see the argument for it more than I think I did in the past, even if I don't still necessarily fully agree with it. All right, that is all I have to say here. I think this ended up being a little bit rambly, but I'm going to try to organize this as best I can. All of the matches from the event will be on my channel. They will be in the same playlist as this one. There's no commentary for any of them because I was really trying to focus up and play my best. But they're all going to be there, so you can peruse them if you want, and they will be recorded there so they can be seen at any time in the future. And with that, I am going to close this out, and I guess I will see some of you in the Gladiator games for Tarkir, and probably in the next season finals. And I guess we'll see if I can three-beat, maybe. Probably not, but I didn't think I was going to win this one, so who knows? We'll see how it goes. All right, thank you.